my topic is about space. Why is not public visibility in Western Europe always situated in space, in public space? Yes, certainly. But what then is the difference if we talk about a woman covered with a hijab or about a minaret? Both are visible in public space. And so is the beard of an imam and the t-shirt of a young Muslim with a religious or political statement. And what is the difference between a publicly visible minaret and the publicly audible call to prayer? The difference is that mosques and minarets are hard structures of greater duration. They are built for permanent use. They are continuously visible, except for fog. When the woman with the headscarf and the man with the beard have moved on, the minaret is still there. When the call to prayer is over, the cupola of the mosque can still be seen. This is why, first of all, I want to think with you about some aspects of space in a more general theoretical way. This will enable us, in a second step, to understand why the capacities to constitute space are unequally distributed and why space is often disputed. The third section of my lecture will then look at some specific cases of religious buildings, Muslim and non-Muslim, in order to test these general principles. After this, I will have a closer look at one specific mosque building project and at the concept of recognition. At the end, I will provide a brief link between the Swiss minaret ban and the preceding chapters. What helped me decisively to understand space better in relation to my research interests is the sociology of space worked out by German sociologist Martina Löw. Let me present some of her basic insights. Space is not just there. Space is a meaningful category for us only insofar as it is constituted socially. Henri Lefebvre has been the most prominent academic to elaborate on this idea. Subsequently, the humanities took a spatial turn. Research began to see space not any longer as a given, unchanging container, ready to be filled with historical developments. Rather, space was seen as something which gets its meaning only through the acts of man. Löw now analyzes this process in much detail and gets as a definition, first the German, quote, Raum ist eine relationale Anordnung oder Ordnung sozialer Güter und Lebewesen an Orten, unquote. Or in English, space is a relational arrangement of social goods and living beings in places, unquote. Social goods, in Löw's terminology, can be either material, for example, a house, a table, or symbolic objects, a song, a law. In fact, she stresses that objects always have both dimensions, but depending on the situation, one or the other dimension is more prominent. The word arrangement is important. Social goods and living beings are not just there in a chaotic way, but somebody has arranged them. Who has arranged them? A tree in a city has been planted by the communal gardening service. Some of the living beings have positioned themselves. If you are new in town and you start going to the same cafe every morning, sitting on the same seat every time, you will begin to be a part of that place. After a few days, the waiter and other regular guests will know you. they will start thinking about what has happened to you if you do not show up. And you yourself, you will be irritated if somebody else sits on the seat that somehow has become your seat by regular use. Analytically, two processes have to be distinguished. One process is what Löw calls spacing. We could also speak of placing or positioning. For example, the waiter puts the bistro tables outside every morning and you position yourself at one specific table. The other process is perception. The waiter sees you. After some time, he may bring you coffee even though you have not ordered it, because he knows what you want to drink, usually. Perhaps he will start placing a card on the table reading réservé when the hour approaches where you usually show up. But if the waiter is ill, another guest will take your seat. You will find your seat occupied when you arrive, and the day may have started very badly in your perception. You see the parallels and the differences of this little scenery to questions of immigration and to mosque building. Where is the immigrant's place? There is enough physical space, but it is obviously a question of negotiation until the specific place for a refugee's home or for a mosque is more or less accepted. You also see the role custom and individual habitus plays in all this. You may bring in Bourdieu. Questions of power relations are also very present. Continue with Foucault, for example. Löw, building on Anthony Giddens, puts it like this: the routines are embedded in spaces. This can be institutions, law, for example, or power relations. To sum it up, for Löw, space is not the neutral scenery where the doings and dealings of society take place. Space is rather one form, one dimension of the social. Spatial structures are one form, one version of social structures. As social relations are constantly changing, even if hardly perceptible during certain periods, so are their spatial expressions constantly changing. Before we turn to religious buildings, let us follow Löw one step further. If space is just one dimension of the social, then it should be possible to find social inequality embodied in space as well. Here Löw builds on the concept of social inequality proposed by Reinhard Kreckel. This concept distinguishes four dimensions of goods and immaterial capital that are unequally distributed. Social and material goods form the dimension of wealth. For example, if you have 10,000 euro, you cannot build a football arena. It's just too little. There is the dimension of knowledge. Symbolic and cultural goods are meant here. For example, if you know how to convince the public, you may get a building permission in a prominent place where other people would not have got it. There is a third dimension, the dimension of rank or status. It's about social positions. For example, if you are a prominent film star or a member of the government, you will readily get the best seat in the theater. By the way, there are other magnificent seats here in front. Fourth dimension is the dimension of association. If you are already belonging to the milieu where you want to build a mosque, it will be easier if you have newly arrived, and it will be easier than if you have newly arrived and nobody knows you. You may now have thought, well, my 10,000 euro are not enough money to build the football arena, but I am extremely good in other things. I am able, for example, to start a campaign arousing enthusiasm so that many people will give a small share, what makes a large sum in the end. I'm also able to fill some VIP with the same enthusiasm, and I'm able to make people think that their social environment will just be incomplete without this football arena. In other words, you can make up for what is lacking by other means. To a certain degree, you can convert the goods and immaterial capital from one dimension into the other. You can, for example, convert cultural capital into monetary capital. Let's get to the disputed space now. You could think, is this, no, this is a special case. Usually things go without dispute. But is it really a special case when players are disputing about building projects? I would say no. Even before the words Islam and Muslim became part of public discourse, there were disputes about public space, at least in Switzerland. Should a highway be built through an area of natural preserve, for example? Should an important enterprise be allowed to construct a landmark building which some consider ingenious architecture and others just ugly? Should the law be changed in a way to allow the construction of exclusive villas on lakesides where normally nobody can build, just to attract wealthy individuals as taxpayers? Wherever there are inequalities and diverging interests, you may expect dispute about space. Such disputes are nothing else than the struggle of actors to enlarge their options to act. They are a common and very natural phenomenon. This is one reason why society have rules and laws regulating the use of space. In a constitutional state, these disputes usually take the form of a bureaucratic process and eventually lawsuits. And in constitutional democracies, the sphere of politics and the media also come in. I will come back to that. But now it's time to look at some cases of religious buildings. After what I've said, we are no longer surprised to find disputes about mosques and minarets. Both are spatial consequences of the relatively recent presence of practicing Muslims. But for how long are practicing Muslims now present in Western Europe? Since a bit more than 5 decades. And since when do we have conflicts over mosques? Since 2.5 decades, approximately. So what have disputes over mosques, why have disputes over mosques emerged so late? Or, to put the question in a more general and scientific way, under what conditions are mosque building projects disputed? If we ask the question like this, we are about to embark in what Stefano Allievi calls Islamic exceptionalism, which he defines as, quote, a tendency to see Islam and Muslims as an exceptional case rather than a standard one, which therefore requires special bodies, actions, and specifically targeted reactions, unlike those used for other groups and religious minorities, unquote. Of course, Allievi is skeptical towards the premises and the normative consequences of this dominant exceptionalist attitude. Nevertheless, he directed an international collection of case studies exclusively about mosque building conflicts. It's available on the internet. At the Department for the Study of Religions in Lucerne, we took a different path. Shall I say, we did not find enough mosque building conflicts in Switzerland. My colleague, Professor Baumann, is a specialist for Buddhism and Hinduism, especially in diaspora contexts, whereas I am coming from Islamic studies. And we are both interested in religious diversity in Western European contexts. And we knew about cases of conflict which did not concern mosques, but, for example, a huge temple of the anthroposophist congregation in Dornach, near Basel, in the 1920s. So we began a project concerning those religious buildings in Switzerland that have been built since World War II by any immigrant religious community and that can be recognized from outside as religious buildings. We have asked the same question regarding all of these buildings. Under what conditions are recognizable religious buildings of immigrant religious community disputed in the planning stage? I think it is legitimate to limit the analysis to the stage of planning because once the building is there, it is usually no longer an object of dispute. The planning and approval procedure is precisely meant to weigh all demands and objections according to the rules set by the state under the rule of law. Of course, this is also the moment when mediated debates and political moves come in. The whole procedure is the objectivated, institutionalized form of a dispute, if you want. Our approach of looking at all religions may help to avoid the pitfalls of Islamic exceptionalism and to take Islam just as a religion like all others. For answering the general research question, we used the 4 dimensions of social inequality developed by Kreckel and operationalized them in the following way. First, we have the dimension of wealth. It's relatively easy. It's about money primarily and perhaps other material resources. Perhaps manpower you can think of. Then there is the dimension of knowledge. There you have several aspects. The architect, a good architect, is an important person for a building project. People who know how to communicate, to have a concept, a strategy for communication. Or somebody who is able to handle legal obstacles in a productive way. Then we have this dimension of rank or status. Here it's about positions of influence of individual people, for example, the representatives of the congregation, or the advocates, so partners of the congregation who are not affiliates themselves, or the money sources for the whole project. These may be donors, at the same time perhaps affiliates, or the bank. Then we go on with the dimension of association. This is extremely manifold. You have the nationality of the majority of members. If they are all citizens, it's a bit easier, one could think. The duration of the presence of that congregation in the municipality is important, or could prove important. The duration of the presence of that religious tradition in the whole country also, because that heightens the chance that somebody has already known or learned about it. The affinity of donors to that project or to the congregation, but also the social environment. It's not the same if you want to build your temple or your mosque in a big city or in a small village, as we shall see. There is one more dimension to add, as Martin Baumann and I believe, the dimension of prestige. It reflects the long-term image of discursive constructions such as a specific religion, Whereas the dimension of status, as I said, is about specific identifiable actors. But the prestige of a religion is also something which is at stake sometimes. This is how we tried to operationalize this dimension. So it's about the prestige of the religion in question. At the same time, or alternatively, it can be about the culture of origin of that congregation, or it can be special factors like the refugees bonus sometimes. In fact, the hierarchy of prestige is already discussed by Krekl as a part of the framework, but Martin Baumann and I consider it justified to add it as a dimension of its own. To be clear, we did not operationalize these 5 dimensions as measurable quantities on a detailed scale, although one possibly could do this. We just decided whether a specific sub-dimension was in favor or neutral or to the disadvantage of the congregation who wanted to construct a religious building. According to that model, the 5 dimensions reflect the possibilities to constitute space, to create space. Building a mosque or a Buddhist temple is one way of constituting space. Generally speaking, a high number of favorable elements augments the possibilities to constitute space, a low number lowers them. Now, if we look at mosque building projects in general, we would probably say the general prestige of this religion and of the culture of origin is near to zero, forget about mosque building. But we all know that one or the other recognizable mosque has been built in the last 20 years, although there has probably been some dispute over certain aspects or over the project as a whole. This can only mean that the other dimensions count as well, and they can probably make up for a very bad score on the prestige scale. So again, under what conditions are religious building projects, including mosques, disputed? And what are the disputes about? How do they evolve? What helps to avoid them? Now let's look at my first example. This is the Mahmoud Mosque in Zurich, in Switzerland, built in 1962-63. When the community wanted to build this building, there were several weak points. I will now always have a balance sheet with the weak points and the strong points for each building. The individuals of the community were foreign nationals, so they were foreigners. They had a short presence in the country, a short presence in the municipality, and the money for the building came from a foreign source, so not very much connection to the social environment there. But on the plus side, the strong points, if you want, are Zurich is a big city, used to diversity, as every big city. The money was enough. There was no dispute about the money being there. The community was able to engage a renowned domestic architect, and it had a few internationally known affiliates, for example, the former Pakistani foreign minister. There was no dispute during the planning process. Let me just give you a second picture. Here the Mahmoud Mosque is in the background. In the vicinity there was already a church tower more than twice as high than the minaret. And so there was no danger of this tiny minaret somehow being a concurrence for the Reformed Church, the Protestant Church there. There was a dispute afterwards because somebody said in the municipal parliament, well, why does the city authority give or help to find a building and construction lot to this foreign community, but not to other domestic communities who also want to build somewhere. But it was not directly against this project. It was more sort of small political quarrel. So, next building, the Tibetan Monastery in Rikon, in the canton of Zurich, but in a remote area. The Tibetans who came in the beginning 60s were foreign nationals, of course. They had a very short presence in the country. There was no earlier presence in that municipality. People there had never seen a Tibetan before, probably. It was a village not used to diversity, and the money partly came from foreign sources. The construction lot was in a no construction zone. This is forest and prairie somehow. So that normally you could not construct a building there. But there were several strong points. These refugees came from a communist context, communist oppression, if you want. And there were mountain people like us, so this counts in Switzerland if you come from a mountain area. Then the arrival of these people was positively reported, and a part of the money came from a domestic donor. There were two brethren running a factory in that small village, and they somehow all the way along helped these Tibetans with money, with working, with jobs in their factory, and also to overcome the difficulties in constructing there, in this remote place outside the core village. So the local advocates were very important in this case. Now again to Zurich town. Here we are in a central district of Zurich. This is a Greek Orthodox church built beginning of the 80s. The weak points, the strong points perhaps first. The Greeks had a stable presence in that city since quite a time. The money came from an individual donor of that community, and the good image of the Greek culture was certainly also a plus. Zurich, as I said, is a big city, so this is all in favor of the building project, but the city authority wanted an innovative instead of a traditional architecture. And they managed to have the majority in the jury, which had to decide about several projects. So this was the project realized in the end. And the congregation was extremely unhappy with this. When we interviewed that pastor, he said, well, nobody can tell you this is a Greek Orthodox church. This is just ugly. And he has to have his apartment in that building, near to that busy road. So that's why I show you also the interior in this case. Here the pastor is fine and everything is as he wants it. So often we have the dichotomy between exterior and interior. Well, this was the Greek Orthodox Church. Here we are with a thrilling case in the canton of Bern in Langenthal. Langenthal is a small town and it's about a Sikh temple, a Sikh Gurdwara. The Sikhs, of course, most of them were foreign nationals having fled in the early 80s from India. The donor of this building was sued by the Swiss state in a complicated procedure. Finally, he was not accused because nothing could be proven, and the thing was stopped. The manager, to make it even better, was a former aeroplane hijacker. he is a very active person, and he obviously wanted to begin a new life, which I think he managed quite well. But you could have put him on that point. The whole congregation had a short presence in the country, even there were no Sikhs before that, and there was no earlier presence in that municipality. The image of the Sikhs is ambivalent, so there are violent episodes in the Sikh history. Sometimes Sikhism is mixed up with Islam, but in favor, if you want, if people really know, it is not Islam. That could be a strong point in some way. The Sikhs are a minority in their country of origin, and they display exotism, if you want. The picture here is a good example. The money from that donor was at hand, the money was there, he paid more or less the whole temple. And what the community, the congregation did, I'll show you a second picture. Look at the, how do you call that? These things. And now look at this. Here you have the temple in the background, and you see a factory in the neighborhood. Here, the same elements. This is the factory which produces these elements. So the manager was clever enough to order them from that factory just nearby. So he took the local industry just into his project, and that was important to win part of the population. Next, we are still in the canton of Bern. A Serb Orthodox Church built end of the 2000s. The Serbs are mostly foreign nationals, but there is quite a presence in the country already, but not in that municipality. But a weak point, at the time they were considered coming from a violent region. The Balkan wars were not so far away. And Belp is a village, it's a small municipality. And the Balkans, people from the Balkans in general had a bad reputation at the time because there were some car accidents of fast driving Balkan youth and so on. And this may have led to the decision in the area where you want to build being destructed overnight by unknown perpetrators. So this happened twice before the building permission was given. What were the strong points in this example? The Serbs are quite an important minority in Switzerland, and there was an alliance with the local churches, the Catholic and the Protestant churches, and an information event. The money was also at hand, so in the end I think the information campaign helped to overcome that anonymous opposition, which did not really show up. One party was openly against, but it then became silent. So now let's have another mosque. Here we are still near to Langenthal, where the Sikh Gurdwara was. It's just a few kilometers away in the village of Wangen. And this particular mosque helped to trigger that whole minaret debate in 2006, which ended up with the referendum. The Turks in general mostly are foreign nationals in Switzerland. They are coming from a violent region as the Serbs were, if you want another weak point. Most importantly, they were not present in that municipality before, and it was a village not used to diversity. Islam had a bad image, and the congregation were ülkücüler, so what we call grey wolves, with an additional weak point, if you want. And there was opposition from local people and from the local churches communication of the congregation was late and little. These were very serious shortcomings, although the strong point is the Turks were there that since 20 years in the nearby town of Olten, and it were only, if you want minor changes on an existing buildings, the only visible thing is the minaret. So this here was there before. This is for the elevator. This was a small industry making painting colors. So the project was okay, but the community had no acceptance in the population. I have chosen the preceding cases out of a total of nearly 30 because they show a wide range of factors in different combinations. So again, under what conditions are religious buildings, not only mosques, disputed? And what are the disputes about? How do they evolve? What avoids them? The observations we have systematized so far are these. Not all building projects of immigrant religious communities are disputed, even not then when there are several weak points. Think of the Sikh case. Disputes can be about a broad variety of aspects, about the presence of the specific community as such, about the presence of foreign people, the visible presence of that specific community, think of the minaret, the spatial dimensions of the planned building, some people think it's too high or too broad, too large, about the presumed increase in traffic and noise, about the presumed acoustic or olfactoric presence of the specific community. When Tamils build a temple, it smells because they are cooking, and the Sikhs also. It can also be about presumed difficulties with car parking, very often. It can be about security. Some of these issues, which I have enumerated, can be negotiated and are accessible to compromise. You can build the minaret 4 meters lower, for example. Or you can add another 20 parking lots so that no wild parking will happen. Other disputes are disputes of principle. That's why the conflict research distinguishes between divisible and indivisible conflicts. You cannot just build a little bit of a mosque. You either build a mosque or you don't, one which is recognizable. This would be an indivisible question. So, let's go on with the observations. The image of the congregation or the community is subject to considerable change over time. Tamils were badly reputed beginning of the 80s. Now they are the example of good integration in Switzerland. It's really ironic sometimes. Having been present in the municipality for some years and having local, especially domestic friends and contacts helps very much. These can be local acquaintances, local business partners, local ideological partners, for example churches, local donors, local key persons, architects, politicians. Building is easier when the community is not new in the municipality. The reason for this is that the local partners are a sort of guarantor to the society. You could say, if these well-reputed and known people are dealing peacefully with that unknown congregation, then the congregation could prove acceptable. That's how people think. Big cities seem to be more tolerant to diversity and to building projects than small cities or villages in general. There are exceptions. opposition to a mosque in Cologne, for example. And even in a skeptical setting, opposition can be handled if communication about the building project begins early and if it's honest and attentive to the concerns of the people. And finally, I want also to stress that there are always specific factors. Each case has its individual character. If, for example, the journalist in charge of the dossier at the local newspaper is uncritical or severely biased, this may unduly amplify the oppositional voices and intimidate political key figures. If the local representative of a political party with xenophobic leanings happens to be a pragmatic and less xenophobic, the project may smoothly find its way, as for example in Langenthal with the Sikh Gurdwara. I'm sure you will easily identify all of these factors and features in Belgian cases and building projects of immigrant religious communities. When preparing, I read in the Allievi documentation the chapter of Felice d'Assetto about the mosque dispute in Bastogne. And I think there are very many parallels to the case in Wangen, the last picture which I showed you, that minaret on the elevator. So think about comparing such cases under this with this analytical tool. The theory of Löwenkräkel thus allows us to analytically grasp the factors fairly well that play a role in the outcome. Martin Baumann and I would just add a stronger accent on the prestige dimension. In the case of Islam, these stereotypes are so strong that I often have the impression of studying two Islams, in fact. Islam 1 is what is being lived in mosques and Muslim houses, and Islam 2 is what I read in the newspaper and what I hear from people who do not know Muslims. I know from our research project among young Muslims that most of them have a similar impression. We have to bear in mind this ambiguity of the word Islam into today's Western societies when looking at mosque building projects. So, allow me. That was the longest chapter. Now it gets shorter. What now about mosque building projects in particular? As we know, opposition, often an opposition of great strength, is the rule. Smooth realization is the exception. Why is this so? Because Western contemporaries tend to perceive Muslims as the paradigmatic other, as some colleagues have put it, as something to keep away in order to preserve one's own identity. You all know how much the negative image of Islam is built on erroneous assumptions, and it is part of your lecture series to reflect on the implications. But the negative image of Islam is there, it has consequences, and in this sense, it is a fact to reckon with. When the Turkish association dependent on Diyanet realized its project in neo-Ottoman style in 2008 in the German town of Duisburg, without major problems, the local newspaper headlined Das Wunder von Marxloh, the miracle of Marxloh, and Marxloh being the particular city district. You want to see that wonder of Marxloh? Miracle of Marxloh? Here it is. Indeed, the case might appear as a miracle against the background of the negative image, which is supposedly firmly established. But let us have a closer look. A newspaper was so kind to deliver a convenient summary description of the factors that led to the success. these factors, I summarize the newspaper now. The factors are: the association has a long presence in the city district. It is affiliated to official Turkish Diyanet structure, but has kept its autonomy of action in this project. It is the generation of those aged 30 to 40 who have decisive influence within the association. So this means they have grown up in the region and they know its rules and codes. The association began to inform their neighbors early. They set up an advisory board which included non-Muslims. The association very early secured the support of the mayor, although this is not a guarantee. They made the funding transparent. The Center for Interreligious Encounters, which is part of the whole complex, is funded by the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia and the European Union. The rest is financed by thousands of small donations. And finally, key positions of the association and of the project management are occupied by dynamic women, disproving stereotypes of the dependent Muslim woman wearing a headscarf and leaving the work to her husband. So, why are these elements so important for success in the present period of a bad image of Islam? Or, to remain with the imagery of my lecture title, why is it these elements that help preparing the difficult ground on which the mosque is to be built? The key word, in my opinion, is recognition. And I want now to link the concept of recognition with the theory of space as elaborated by Martina Löw. Things are quite simple, I think. Recognition has to do with cognition, derived from the Latin root cognoscere, to know. You can only recognize what you have already known before. The same applies to the Germanic version of the word. To acknowledge also comprises to know. In German, recognition as well as acknowledgement can be translated by the same word, Anerkennung. Knowing the people around oneself is the most basic social activity. Knowing them, recognizing them, and acknowledging certain aspirations they have are not the same. The series of concepts rather expresses an increase in the density and commitment of interaction. Recognition expresses a certain amount of liability and reliability. It implies nearness. Usually it is the local environment that people know best. They are familiar with it. This is why they care more about changes in their environment than about changes elsewhere. So it's logical that "not in my backyard" is a frequent motive in campaigns against sites for toxic disposals, for example, or against mosques, for that matter. Now, if you know some of the people who want to build that mosque in your backyard, if earlier you have already made the experience that they are quite normal people, you will be more disposed to let them build their mosque. But if you do not know them, your opinion will depend on what others tell you about them. And if nobody around you knows them, then you will depend on what the newspaper writes on them. And if the newspaper does not write about that congregation, you will take whatever it writes about Islam in general as a standard for your judgment, no matter how inadequate it might be. This is why personal acquaintance with the other and mutual knowledge about the other is essential to recognition and to extraordinary building projects such as mosques. A successfully completed building project, therefore, is usually taken as an expression of achieved recognition by both sides. the receiving society, and the congregation. Of course, religions do not only have a local dimension. They usually claim a validity transcending the local. They may be dependent on the word of a spiritual leader residing far away. The translocal factors may also influence the image of the local community. It is these translocal factors which the theory of space developed by Martina Löw does not sufficiently take into account. So, we arrive at our last chapter. The translocal dimension has in fact played a decisive role in the Swiss dispute about minarets in 2005 to 9, which ended up with a minaret ban being added to the Swiss constitution by way of a national referendum. So let me add some remarks about that ignominious vote. Switzerland is a semi-direct democracy, meaning that there is a mixture of indirect or representative and of direct institutions. This is true for all three levels: municipality, canton, and confederation. The people elect representatives for the parliaments. The national government is about the cantonal governments directly by the citizens. But additionally, the citizens have the possibility to decide on subject matters by way of a referendum if a sufficient number of people are calling for this. The minaret project of the mosque in Wangen, together with two other projects, was at the origin of the minaret ban. Some citizens in the region of Wangen and elsewhere considered it to be a scandal that the courts had allowed the minaret to be built. To use the terminology of recognition, the courts had recognized the congregation's right to build the minaret, but the citizens, or some citizens, did not. They thought it necessary to change the law by way of a Volksinitiative, or citizens' initiative. The initiative read, "The construction of minarets is forbidden." This clause was to be added to the constitution. Of course, from a legal point of view, this clause unduly discriminates against followers of one specific religion. But since there is no constitutional court in Switzerland, the procedure went on. A committee of right-wing politicians collected the necessary 100,000 signatures of Swiss citizens entitled to vote. The federal government, as well as the parliament, expressed themselves against the clause, but finally, on 29th of November 2009, a majority of 57.5% of those going to the polls voted in favor of that clause. The turnout was 53%, so it was still a minority of all people entitled to vote who wanted the ban, but important is how many cast their vote. This result came as a surprise to everybody, even to the demoscopes. As with every referendum, there is also a survey after this vote. There was a survey after this vote. This survey asked voters to give the two most important reasons for casting a yes or a no. Among the yes voters, the most frequent first-named reasons were these. Minarets are symbols of Islamization, was the most heard argument of those who said yes to the ban. Only 15% said minarets are not a necessary element for mosques. An equal share said Christian faith has to be defended, especially because of building obstacles for Christians in Islamic countries. And still an equal share, minarets do not fit the Swiss landscape. And only 9% said Muslims do not follow our laws. As you can see, these are all very general arguments derived from the debate before the vote. But the survey also tested arguments and opinions related to the ban proposal. Here we see that 85% shared the opinion that women are oppressed in Islam. So even people who share this view must have said no to the ban. 64% of the voters agreed fully or quite that Swiss and Muslim ways of life are compatible with each other. So this means the Muslims, they know they get along with them quite well. Or to put it in the terms which a newspaper used as a headline of this survey, Swiss citizens are against Islam, but not against Muslims. Of course, what he is against, this Swiss citizens, is what I labeled Islam too, earlier in my lecture. So the newspaper and hearsay Islam. If he knows personally a Muslim or several Muslims, he gets along with it. Why did a majority vote for the ban? I see a combination of reasons. The pro-ban campaign succeeded in making people think that they that they had to do with Islam too, the newspaper and hearsay Islam. This is easy in a country where people consider religion something private, something you usually do not talk about. Non-Muslims just have no idea about Islam one, so the varieties of Islam lived in their neighborhood. The second reason, in my opinion, there was virtually no campaign against the ban. The Muslim organizations had decided early not to lead an active campaign. Non-Muslim political elites were against the proposed ban, but hardly anybody systematically went on tour to convince people in the street, especially outside the urban centers. There were no financial interests at stake. More importantly, the elite, politicians, but also journalists, usually caring little for religion, felt personally unsure about how to handle this issue. Let me try to conclude. Changes in public space are sensitive issues. This applies not only to mosques and minarets. In order to understand disputes about Muslim building projects, it is useful to build on a general theory of space and to compare Muslim and non-Muslim religious building projects. The theory of space, as developed by Martina Löw, has proven to be a good starting point. The concept of social inequality proposed earlier by Reinhard Kreckel is a useful additional tool for looking at specific cases. However, in the case of religions being involved, disputes have an additional dimension. Many religions have a universal claim and are globally present. A specific congregation in Belgium or Switzerland is therefore easily associated with phenomena elsewhere. It is necessary to include the dimension of general prestige of the religious community into the analysis. The example of the Turkish mosque in Marxloh has shown how a mosque building project can succeed quite smoothly, even if there are weak points in the balance sheet. On the other hand, the case of the minaret in Wangen has shown that a congregation may overcome local opposition by way of the courts, but by doing so, it cannot win the most important good, recognition. Even worse, the Wangen case was won by the local congregation at the expense of other Muslims because it helped triggering a national campaign for a general ban on minarets. Eventually, the campaign was successful under the specific conditions of semi-direct democracy and widespread ignorance about religions and everyday lived Islam. And now, my last slide. Thank you for your attention.